In the forests of northern Montana, wildlife rehabilitator Jake Thornton and his colleague Emily Walker were patrolling a remote trail when they heard faint cries coming from the underbrush. Investigating cautiously, they discovered 3 abandoned bobcat kittens, but heartbreakingly, only one was still alive. Against protocol, Jake took the fragile survivor, Bella, under his care, nursing her back from the brink. Weeks turned into months as Bella grows from a fragile orphan into a magnificent predator. An extraordinary bond formed between the solitary man and the wild cat. But the wild called, and Jake knew Bella's destiny lay back in the forest. Forced by circumstance to leave her at a sanctuary miles away, Jake believed their chapter was closed. But a year passed, and Bella remained distant and depressed, failing to connect with other animals. Can a wild creature truly remember? This extraordinary story challenges everything we think we know about the hearts of wild animals, and the humans brave enough to love them. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The early morning mist hung like a veil over the dense pine forests of northern Montana. It was late April, and the first hints of spring were beginning to awaken the wilderness after a long, harsh winter. Jake Thornton pulled his weathered Ford pickup to a stop at the trailhead and cut the engine. At 42, Jake had spent over half his life working as a wildlife rehabilitator in these forests. His rugged appearance, complete with a salt and pepper beard and deep crow's feet around his eyes, testament to years spent in the elements. "Beautiful morning?" remarked Emily Walker, Jake's colleague of 3 years, as she climbed out of the passenger side. At 35, Emily had joined the Northern Montana Wildlife Rehabilitation Center after a decade as a veterinary technician, drawn by her passion for wild animal conservation. Perfect day for trail maintenance. Jake nodded, pulling his worn leather gloves from his back pocket. "Trail's been getting washed out pretty bad with the spring thaw. Figure we can clear some debris, check the camera traps while we're at it." They gathered their gear, backpacks filled with tools, water, and emergency supplies, and set off along the narrow dirt path that wound through towering ponderosa pines and Douglas firs. Spring was Jake's favorite time in the forest, the world coming back to life after winter's grip. New growth pushing through the forest floor, wildlife emerging with their young. 2 hours into their work, as they approached a particularly remote section of the trail, Emily froze. "Jake, wait, do you hear that?" Jake stopped, tilting his head. At first, all he could hear was the gentle rustling of pine needles in the morning breeze and the distant call of a red-tailed hawk. Then, faintly, he caught it. A small, distressed cry coming from somewhere in the dense underbrush to their right. "Could be injured wildlife," he said quietly, instinctively lowering his voice. "Let's check it out, but keep your distance until we know what we're dealing with." They moved carefully off the trail, stepping over fallen logs and pushing through thick mountain laurel. The cries grew more distinct, high-pitched, mewling sounds that tugged at Jake's heart. After 20 years in wildlife rehabilitation, he could recognize the sound of an animal in distress. "There," Emily whispered, pointing to a hollow beneath a rotting log. Jake approached cautiously, crouching down to peer into the small space. What he saw made his breath catch. 3 tiny bobcat kittens, no more than a few weeks old, were huddled together in a nest of leaves and fur. Their spotted coats were unmistakable, but as Jake looked closer, his heart sank. 2 of the kittens were completely still, their small bodies already growing cold. Only one showed signs of life, weakly mewling and struggling to raise its tiny head. "Damn," Jake muttered, a familiar heaviness settling in his chest. Looks like Mom hasn't been back for a while. Emily knelt beside him, her face reflecting the same mixture of sadness and concern. "Probably hunted and killed," she said softly. "We've had reports of poachers in this area last month." Jake nodded grimly. The illegal hunting of predator species was an ongoing battle in these parts, despite the efforts of conservation officers. He'd seen the devastating effects firsthand: orphaned cubs, destroyed habitats, the delicate balance of the ecosystem thrown into chaos. "The two aren't going to make it," he said quietly, gesturing to the motionless kittens. "Already gone. But this little one." He focused on the surviving kitten, a female with unusual markings, a perfect white diamond shape on her chest, standing out against her tawny, spotted coat. "She's severely dehydrated," Emily said, her experienced eye taking in the kitten's condition. "Probably hasn't eaten in days." Jake knew the protocol. Wild animals, especially predators like bobcats, were supposed to be left alone whenever possible. Human intervention was a last resort. But looking at the tiny kitten, fighting for each breath, Jake couldn't bring himself to walk away. "We need to bury these two," he said, gently reaching for the lifeless kittens. With Emily's help, they dug a small grave nearby and laid the tiny bodies to rest, a solemn ritual Jake had performed more times than he cared to remember. When they returned to the surviving kitten, Jake made a decision. "I'm taking her," he said, removing his outer flannel shirt and fashioning it into a makeshift carrier. "She won't last the day out here alone." Emily didn't protest. They both knew the risks involved in removing a wild animal from its habitat, but they also knew when intervention was necessary. Jake approached the kitten slowly, speaking in low, soothing tones. "Hey there, little one," he murmured. "I know you're scared. I know you want your mama." The kitten's eyes, barely open, focused on Jake. They were a striking blue-gray, clouded with fear and exhaustion, but still burning with a fierce will to live. Something in that gaze struck Jake deeply. A connection, a silent plea. Very gently, he scooped the tiny creature into his hands. She was so light, so fragile, her little body trembling against his calloused palms. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" Jake whispered, carefully wrapping her in his shirt. "That's good. You're going to need that spirit." On the hike back to the truck, Jake cradled the kitten close to his chest, trying to keep her warm. He'd seen enough wildlife rescues to know that her chances were slim, but something about this particular animal made him determined to save her. "What are you going to name her?" Emily asked as they reached the vehicle. Jake looked down at the small bundle in his arms, at the distinctive white diamond on her chest. "Bella," he said after a moment. "Her name is Bella." The drive back to town was tense, with Jake constantly checking on the kitten while Emily made calls to the wildlife center and the local veterinarian, Dr. Martins, who specialized in treating wild animals. By the time they arrived at the veterinary clinic, Bella had grown even weaker, refusing the drops of sugar water Jake had carefully administered from a small dropper he kept in his emergency kit. Dr. Sarah Martins, a woman in her early 50s with kind eyes and capable hands, was waiting for them. She had worked with Jake on numerous rescues over the years and trusted his judgment implicitly. "Let's see what we've got," she said, leading them quickly to an examination room. She took the tiny bobcat from Jake with practiced gentleness, placing her on the examination table. "Female, approximately 3 to 4 weeks old," Dr. Martins noted, conducting a thorough examination. "Severe dehydration, possible hypoglycemia. She's malnourished, but I don't see any obvious injuries or infections." For the next hour, Dr. Martins and her team worked to stabilize Bella, administering fluids subcutaneously and gradually warming her body temperature. Jake stayed throughout, unable to leave, his weathered face etched with concern. "Does she have a chance?" he asked finally as Dr. Martins finished the treatment. The veterinarian gave him a cautious smile. "She's responded well to the fluids. The next 24 hours will be critical, but she's a fighter, this one. If she makes it through the night, her chances improve significantly." "I want to take her home," Jake said firmly. "I've got the experience, the setup for rehabilitation." Dr. Martins hesitated. "Jake, you know the protocols. The Wildlife Center has facilities specifically designed for—" "Sarah," Jake interrupted, using her first name deliberately. "You know as well as I do that the center is overcrowded right now. Spring always brings more rescues than they can handle. I've rehabilitated bobcats before. I've got the permits. I can do this." After a long moment, Doctor, Martins nodded. "All right, but I want daily updates, and you bring her in at the first sign of any complications." That night, Jake transformed his spare bedroom into a makeshift rehabilitation space, setting up a temperature-controlled enclosure with soft bedding. Every 2 hours, he woke to feed Bella a special formula designed for wild feline kittens, administering it with a tiny syringe. Each time, he held his breath, hoping she would take the nourishment, praying her tiny body would find the strength to keep fighting. By morning, Bella was still alive, her eyes a bit clearer, her cries slightly stronger. Jake felt a surge of cautious hope. When he called Dr. Martins with an update, he could hear the surprise and relief in her voice. "She's responding to you," the vet said. "That's a good sign. Keep doing what you're doing." Days turned into weeks, and Bella grew stronger. Jake established a careful routine, mindful of the delicate balance between providing necessary care and preventing habituation to humans. As a wildlife rehabilitator, his ultimate goal was always to return animals to the wild. Bella needed to maintain her natural wariness of people, her instincts as a predator. But despite his professional distance, Jake found himself growing attached to the small bobcat. There was something special about her, an intelligence in her eyes, a certain quality to her movements that seemed almost like curiosity or understanding. When she was about 6 weeks old, healthy enough to start exploring beyond her enclosure, she began following Jake around his cabin, watching his every move with those intense blue-gray eyes. "You're not supposed to imprint on me, you know," Jake told her one evening as she curled up near his feet while he worked on paperwork at the kitchen table. "You're meant for the wild, not to be somebody's pet." Bella just blinked up at him, purring softly, a sound that never failed to astonish Jake. Adult bobcats rarely purred. It was primarily a kitten behavior. Yet Bella continued to purr around Jake long after most bobcat kittens would have outgrown the habit. As summer arrived in the Montana mountains, Jake began the next phase of Bella's rehabilitation. He constructed a larger outdoor enclosure adjacent to his cabin, complete with natural elements, rocks, logs, branches for climbing, to help develop her muscular strength and coordination. He introduced live prey, first insects, then small rodents, teaching her to hunt as her mother would have done. Emily visited regularly, helping with Bella's care and providing companionship for Jake, who had grown increasingly isolated, focusing all his energy on the bobcat's rehabilitation. "You're getting too attached," Emily warned him one July afternoon as they watched Bella successfully stalk and pounce on a mouse Jake had released into her enclosure. "What's your exit strategy here?" Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair, which had grown longer over the summer months. I know. She needs to go back to the wild eventually. That's the goal, always has been. But, Emily prompted, knowing her colleague well enough to hear the unspoken reservation. But she's different, Jake admitted. There's something about her, Em. The way she looks at me sometimes. It's like she understands. Emily's expression softened. They're magnificent animals, she agreed. And she owes her life to you. That creates a bond. But Jake, you've been doing this long enough to know that the best thing for her is to live the life she was born to live. Jake knew Emily was right. As summer gave way to fall, Bella grew into a beautiful subadult bobcat, her spotted coat thickening with the approach of winter, her movements becoming more fluid and powerful. She was hunting independently now, demonstrating all the skills she would need to survive in the wild. It was time to begin planning her release, a process that would need to be gradual, carefully coordinated with the changing seasons and available territory. Jake consulted with colleagues at the Wildlife Center, selected a remote area with good bobcat habitat, and began preparations. But complications arose. First, there were reports from neighbors about a bobcat being spotted near residential areas. Almost certainly Bella, who had begun to roam beyond her enclosure on the nights when Jake allowed her supervised freedom. Then came a stern warning from the local wildlife officer about keeping predators in captivity without proper facilities. She's being rehabilitated for release, Jake argued during a tense meeting at the Wildlife Center. I have all the necessary permits. We're following protocol. The longer she stays with you, the harder it will be for her to readjust to the wild, countered Richard Owens, the senior wildlife biologist at the center. And frankly, Jake, there's concern about your objectivity in this case. Before Jake could formulate a response that wouldn't jeopardize his professional standing, his cell phone rang. It was his sister, calling from Oregon with news that their father had suffered a serious heart attack. Jake needed to go immediately, and he had no idea how long he would need to stay. We can take her, Richard offered, his tone softening at Jake's obvious distress. The Eastern Montana Sanctuary has agreed to accept her. They've got a large natural enclosure, other bobcats for socialization. It might be the best solution. With no other options and family obligations pressing, Jake reluctantly agreed. The next morning, heart heavy, he helped transport Bella to the sanctuary, a respected facility about 100 miles east. The staff assured him they would continue her rehabilitation with the goal of eventual release, though they warned him that animals who had spent extended periods with humans sometimes never fully readjusted to life in the wild. Saying goodbye to Bella was one of the hardest things Jake had ever done. As the sanctuary staff led her away in a transport cage, she looked back at him with those intelligent eyes, and Jake could have sworn he saw betrayal in them. I'm sorry, girl, he whispered. I hope you understand someday. Jake spent 3 months in Oregon, helping his father recover from heart surgery and addressing long-neglected family matters. Though he called the sanctuary weekly for updates on Bella, the reports were increasingly concerning. She wasn't integrating well with the other bobcats. She remained aloof, refused to enter the communal areas, and showed signs of stress and depression. She's not thriving, admitted Sandra Nguyen, the sanctuary's director, during a particularly difficult phone call in November. She's physically healthy, but emotionally, it's like she's waiting for something. Or someone. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. Despite his professional training, despite knowing better, he had allowed himself to form a bond with Bella that went beyond the normal rehabilitator-animal relationship. And now she was suffering for it. I'm coming back, he decided, already calculating how quickly he could arrange things with his family. I need to see her." 2 days later, Jake pulled into the sanctuary's gravel parking lot, his heart pounding with anxiety. What if she didn't remember him? What if seeing him again only confused her further, making her rehabilitation even more difficult? Sandra met him at the entrance, her expression guarded. "I should warn you, Jake. She's become quite withdrawn. Don't expect too much." Jake nodded, steeling himself as they walked through the sanctuary grounds toward the Bobcat enclosures. The facility was impressive. Large natural habitats designed to mimic the animal's wild environment while providing safety and necessary care. They stopped outside a spacious enclosure surrounded by a high fence, where a lone bobcat lay motionless on a rocky ledge, her back to the viewing area. "That's her," Sandra said softly. "She spends most of her time up there, away from everyone." Jake approached the fence slowly, his throat tight. "Bella?" he called gently, using the special clicking sound he had often made when feeding her as a kitten. For a moment, nothing happened. The bobcat remained still, giving no indication that she had heard him. Jake's heart sank. Then, almost imperceptibly, her ears twitched. Slowly, she turned her head, looking directly at the fence where Jake stood. Time seemed to stop as their eyes met across the distance. Jake held his breath, searching for any sign of recognition in those familiar blue-gray eyes. For several heartbeats, Bella simply stared, utterly still except for the tip of her tail, which began to twitch rhythmically. Then, in an explosion of movement that startled both Jake and Sandra, Bella leapt from her perch, bounding down the rocks with incredible speed and grace. She raced across the enclosure directly toward Jake, stopping just short of the fence, her entire body vibrating with excitement. "Oh my God," Sandra whispered beside him. "I've never seen her move like that since she arrived." Jake knelt down, bringing himself closer to Bella's level, hardly daring to believe what he was seeing. "Hey there, beautiful girl," he said softly. "Remember me?" Bella paced along the fence, making the distinctive chuffing sound Jake remembered from their time together. Her eyes never left his face, and there was no mistaking the recognition in them. "She knows you," Sandra said, amazement clear in her voice. "After all this time, she absolutely knows you." "Can I go in?" Jake asked, not taking his eyes off Bella. "Please?" Sandra hesitated only briefly before nodding. "We'll need to follow protocol," she said, leading him to a double-gated entry system designed to prevent escapes. "Remember, no matter how she seems, she's still a wild animal. Be careful." Jake entered the enclosure with his heart hammering against his ribs. Bella watched his every move, her tail twitching with increasing intensity. He moved slowly, crouching down several feet away from her, allowing her to decide what happened next. "It's me, Bella," he said quietly. "I've missed you." For a breathless moment, Bella remained where she was, studying him intently. Then, with a grace that took Jake's breath away, she moved toward him. Not with the caution of a wild predator approaching a potential threat, but with the confidence of recognition, of trust. She stopped just in front of him, close enough that Jake could feel her warm breath. Slowly, with deliberate care, she reached forward with one paw and placed it on his knee. The exact greeting gesture she had developed during her time with Jake, a behavior he had never seen in any other bobcat. "She remembers," Jake whispered, tears welling in his eyes despite his efforts to maintain professional composure. "She actually remembers." What happened next astonished even Jake, who thought he had seen everything in his years of wildlife work. Bella moved closer, rubbing her head against his arm, a classic feline sign of affection and recognition. Before sitting beside him, her body relaxed in a way Sandra later said she had never witnessed since Bella's arrival at the sanctuary. "This is extraordinary," Sandra said from outside the enclosure, watching the interaction with wide eyes. "I've worked with wild felids for 15 years, and I've never seen anything quite like this." The meeting lasted nearly an hour, with Bella staying close to Jake, occasionally making soft vocalizations that seemed almost like conversation. When it was finally time for him to leave, Jake felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. What was best for Bella now? She clearly hadn't adjusted to life at the sanctuary, but could she ever truly return to the wild with such a strong attachment to a human? Over the next several days, Jake had lengthy discussions with Sandra and the sanctuary's veterinary team. They reviewed Bella's case history, her behavior, her prospects for different futures. In the end, they reached a conclusion that, while unconventional, seemed to offer the best chance for Bella's well-being. "She can stay here at the sanctuary," Sandra proposed, "in a specialized enclosure that meets all her needs. And you, Jake, can be involved in her care, regular visits, continued enrichment. Not as an owner, she's still a wild animal, but as a special type of caretaker." It wasn't the outcome Jake had initially envisioned when he'd rescued that tiny kitten from the forest. But looking at Bella now, healthy, strong, and somehow against all odds still connected to him, he knew it was the right decision. Jake relocated back to Montana permanently, taking a position that allowed him to be close to the sanctuary. He visited Bella regularly, continuing to work with her in ways that respected her wild nature while acknowledging their unique bond. Over time, she even began to accept other caregivers, though she always maintained a special connection with Jake. On a crisp autumn morning 2 years after their reunion, Jake sat quietly in Bella's enclosure, watching as she expertly stalked a pheasant that had been released as part of her enrichment activities. Her movements were pure poetry, the perfect blend of patience, power, and precision that made bobcats such magnificent predators. As if sensing his admiration, Bella paused in her hunt, turning to look at Jake with those intelligent eyes that had captured his heart that day in the forest. In that moment, Jake felt a profound sense of peace. Their journey together hadn't followed any conventional rehabilitation script, but it had led them both exactly where they needed to be. "Good girl, Bella," he whispered, watching as she returned to her hunt with renewed focus. "You're exactly who you're supposed to be." And in her own way, Jake knew Bella had saved him just as surely as he had saved her.